Welcome to the Hanu Health Podcast, where our mission is to help you to breathe better and stress less. On this show, we discuss a variety of topics and provide practical suggestions for improving health and well-being. However, none of the education, tips, and tricks provided should be taken as medical advice. Your medical doctor is your best bet if you have medical questions. Also, on this podcast, we interview numerous guests from diverse backgrounds, interests, and may carry some unique ideas. Hanu Health as a company does not endorse all statements provided by guests or condone all suggestions or protocols discussed. We just like hearing about cool people doing rad and new things. So sit back, relax, breathe, and enjoy the show. All right, Patrick, we are back for another Q&A episode here on the Hanu Health Podcast. How are things going, man?
Things are going good. I've got a trip coming up soon, so it'll be preparation back into the real bad world of traveling, you know. It was nice to get the reset for a few months. So yeah, so it's all good. So I'll take
it was a reset. Like, it truly was a reset. And it was one of those things, like, it's so funny just kind of how the mind works and how we work as human beings, because, you know, one of the things that happened with COVID, obviously for everybody, is that for at least a period of time, which was like 6 months to a year for most people, there was like barely any travel. And like for me, there was no travel. Like, I didn't get on a plane for almost a year, which was super odd for me because I was flying just like you, I'm sure, flying around everywhere. But it was really nice. It was nice not to have to like live out of a suitcase and to be with family. But after that period of time, like, I got really antsy and I was like, I kind of want to travel. I want to speak. Like, I want to engage with other people at conferences or social events. And then it started back up here recently. And then in the last few months or so, I've been back to traveling again like crazy. And I'm like in this position where I was like, well, I was begging for this. I was hoping that it would come and happen. And now I'm kind of like, oh man, I kind of wish like things would get dialed down. I don't want like the pandemic to spike back up, but what I do want is just like to not have to travel again. Is that your experience at all yet? Or have you not had to travel like nearly as often?
Oh, I think it was wonderful having the reset. And I suppose the other thing is now it's kind of spoiled me.
Yes. In what way?
And I don't want to go back to doing it. Well, you start to realize, you know, it forced us all to have a reset, that we start to see what the priorities are. And it was almost like, as one person says, if you win the rat race, you're still a rat.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And you know, when you're in the corporate world and when you're trying to get your information out there and everything else, you can get so much consumed in what you are doing. And like, it's all great. We are fortunate that we have a job that we love, and that makes a huge difference. And we're also fortunate that we're in control of our own destiny. But coming with that then has own responsibilities. And when you have something like a reset, you don't feel guilty about taking time out to stay at home, because everyone
it's a forced function.
And we had to do it.
Yeah, no, it's true.
There's something nice about it. Something nice.
It really is. And like the idea of having my hand forced, it's like, well, you can't say, you have no say about it. Like, you can't do anything about it. Like, it did help me to just take a moment to pause and say, what's actually important in life? And the thing that was great too is like, so when the pandemic started in the beginning, obviously, of 2020, in April of 2020 was when my second child was born, Micah. And you know what? I look back and I think, man, I am so incredibly grateful that, like, even though like the state of the world like was in really kind of shock, and like this was something that really most of us, if not all of us, had never experienced anything like it before, like I got time during those, you know, that first 6 months to a year really to just spend time with like my newborn and with my oldest son and with my wife. Like, it was just something too that, like, in looking back, like, and you know, hindsight's 2020, I'm like, my goodness, like I would not write it any other way, because I got to engage in the things that bring me a sense of fulfillment and meaning and purpose and value, because my value isn't like traveling or making money or like doing podcasts. Like, I love those things. I enjoy, like you said, engaging in things that bring me a sense of joy. But the thing that brings me true fulfillment is like my relationships and my family. And over the course of the past 2 years now, I really have not felt ever as close to my family as I have now. And so again, like we have to count our blessings and look at the silver linings of some of the chaos chaos. But yeah, now that we're kind of back into the swing of kind of like, the semi old world that we lived in, like I can still look back and try to keep that in mind. And that's going to be a challenge sometimes, when I'm in the hustle and bustle to kind of bring that in. But I think a new part of my gratitude practice is just doing a little bit more deep reflection on the past few years, doing a little bit more introspection of kind of how my priorities have changed, but also how they've strengthened in certain ways. And for me, it's just a great time. So yeah, I wanted to I didn't know we were going to go this route, but I think it's just kind of like a good moment for, our listeners to really kind of do that self check-in, have that level of introspection. I mean, we're all about self-awareness and self-regulation on this podcast. And so I think it would behoove us just to kind of take some time and reflect.
Yeah, totally. I think so. I actually think the younger generations have it more than my generation. I think it was behold of our generation to work 10 and 12 hours a day. And that's what we were talking about just before we started. And I remember when I was at a dinner party in LA, it's going back about 2 years ago, it was about 30 of us on the table. And of course, after a few beers, the old fogies like me are giving out about the young fogies not prepared to do any work. Right. And then one young fogey at the end of the table, he says, we've learned from our parents not to overwork. We've learned priorities in life. And then when you tie that back in, we're talking about heart rate variability. And we have to ask the question, that constant drive and push from society and pressure, that it is more likely to put us into sympathetic activation and keep us stuck in that sympathetic drive. And then if we were to look at American society as a whole, it's seen as the most advanced society on earth. But then if we were to break it down and ask, with advancement, does it bring happiness? And by breaking it down into the number of people with insomnia, the number of people on prescribed medications and helping to bring a calmness and quietness of the mind. So advancement per se is not necessarily advancement. It could actually be to the detriment of society. And HRV, of course, and breathing. And there is a void here because I'm sure in the States, just as where any country and where everybody is listening, and we see it in Ireland, there's very much a drive away from traditions such as religion. And religion served a purpose there, and did serve a purpose in terms of, number one is that you had that social community. Number two is you had that reliance on other people. Number three, you had a belief that there was a higher power there to look after you in terms of a crutch. And number four, the act of saying prayers changed breathing patterns and stimulated the vagus nerve. And it's kind of, when we look at Bernardi's paper, or is it Bordoni? I think it's Bernardi, looking at the effect of the rosary prayer and yoga mantras, slowing down the breath to 6 breaths per minute. So what's going to fill that void? And is it going to be people are realizing that, yes, they are becoming more self-aware, and it's tremendous to see mindfulness really take a hold. And breathing now is the next mindfulness. Breathing now is hot. Mindfulness was hot 10 years ago. And of course, one ties in with the other, and sleep comes in with that as well. So I actually like the direction we're going, Jay. I think society, I think maybe the younger generation are kind of getting this. I think they've got it,
Yeah, it's great points. A lot of times the younger generation can get crapped on for so many things, which some things they probably should get crapped on. I mean, spending 6+ hours a day on Instagram or social media is probably not the best value of your time. And that in and of itself can be sympathetically arousing and cause a decrease in HRV, cause in dysfunctional breathing. So like there are aspects, but nobody's perfect, right? We evolve in some ways and maybe de-evolve in other ways. But to your point, I think it's right. Like we're able to kind of take a step back and say, okay, like, can we learn from what has caused detriment to other people? And then what have also caused detriment to us? And one thing for me is that it's funny because, I'm in my mid 30s but I'm still technically considered a millennial. So I think it's kind of a wide range. I think I'm like on the very edge of what's considered a millennial. And I know a lot of times millennials and then whatever the next generation after mine is called, I don't know. They can, give them kind of crazy names all the time. And
I know you
I
you're
can't
just
keep up with any
confused
of them.
with the X, Y,
Right.
Z
Yeah. I know. I
generation,
can't
huh?
keep up with any of them. But like a lot of people look at them are like, the millennials and whatever, one after me, like they're bad with finances. Like they're always on social media. They're not connecting. And some of those aspects may be true, but we're also learning too that these individuals have a lot of drive and they work smarter, not harder. They're not like, oh, well, I have to pay my dues. Like my dad worked, every single day, never took a day off for, 40 years. And, he worked 12 to 15 hours a day. And we have to say, like, did that bring that person the sense of fulfillment and joy, or did it cause mass dysfunction? And now that he's kind of at the end, able to retire, is he looking back and saying that was worth it? Like, it was worth kind of like paying my dues and kind of like putting in all that time and effort. Did it bring me that sense of fulfillment and joy? And my guess, my hypothesis, is that probably not. He's probably like, what, in the end, the things that I value most is maybe working smarter, not harder, so that I can be there actively engaged in relationships with my family, with my friends, with my religious group or gathering, like all of those things, like go kind of unfortunately by the wayside when we pay our dues. And so I think it's a really valuable thing, just to kind of keep in mind that, like, if we want to truly take a holistic approach and an integrative approach to our health, and we're interested in things like, working on HRV biofeedback, working on mindfulness, working on breath work, is that those are really valuable and key components. But it's also something a little bit more meta than that. It's taking a step back from that and saying, okay, I can integrate those practical skill sets. Like, that's a great thing. But also too, like, what's the main purpose behind this? What's the main reason? Like, why is even health important? Because I ask that question all the time, and that's a very like psychologist, question to ask, is like, well, why would health even be important for you? Like what's the purpose of having good health? What's the purpose of like living? And like, that's when we get into a little bit more of a deeper discussion where it's like, yeah, we can utilize the valuable tools of breath work, of mindfulness, of HRV training or biofeedback. But like, what's the goal? Like, what's the end goal? So that you can say that you're healthy? No, nobody really cares that much about that. They want to say, I feel fulfilled and passionate and thriving and engaged. And if people can come away with that, then their life is just, it's going to be an easier life for anybody. And again, like, and this is cliche, just a much more fulfilled and passionate life too. So, yeah, great thoughts,
Yeah,
Patrick.
totally. We're all striving for one thing, it's
Yeah,
happiness.
absolutely. And it's one thing that we, again, like, I hate like using cliches, but it's real, it's true. Like, it's not necessarily a cliche. Like, we all want to be happy. I've never come across somebody, in the 12 years of clinical practice and research practice that I've engaged now as a clinical psychologist, I've never come across somebody who said, like, my goal in life is to be miserable, is to be unfulfilled, it's to be disengaged and socially isolated. Never met one. Now there's probably going to be some like, person that like emails me after this or like gets on Instagram like, I'm that person, like, I don't want to feel fulfilled. Like, I mean, and then I'm just going to say, yeah, you're a liar or you're, I don't know, you're a sociopath. No, I'm
We're
kidding.
delusioned.
But no, it's true. We all really are striving to be happy. And you can see that in like the way we live life and engage in behavior. Like, sometimes we just don't really have the education or the knowledge of like how what we're engaging in could add to fulfillment and happiness in our life, and how maybe we think it will, but it won't. And that's where people get caught up in things like addiction, when people get caught up in things, like overindulgent, indulging in social media. I keep making fun of all the social media like people right now. It's because for me, I also see like it's a great way to connect, but it's also a really great way to pull away from people. But that's what happens. And our behavior, what we engage in, it's one thing that we can control. I mean, we can always engage in something different, but sometimes we just don't have the great education to kind of understand like whether or not like what we are doing or the behavior we're engaging in, like how it directly like influences true happiness or gives us that kind of false sense of gratification and happiness that really is only temporary, gives a great dopamine pleasure reward center spike. And the next thing we know, we're back at it for more. But on the other side, on the back end of things, it's just causing a just path of damage, miles and miles of damage. So strive for happiness. We just have to do it in a way that is truly fulfilling to us, so that when, it sounds morbid, when we're on our deathbed, like, we will look back and we say, I don't have a regret in that. I'm so glad I did that. Because for me, I don't know about you, Patrick, when I look back on my deathbed, and we're taking this a little bit deep and slightly morbid, but I'm okay with that. When I look back and I'm on my deathbed, whenever that is, when I'm 140, I'm going to look back and say, man, I am so glad that I engaged like with my family instead of like doing, 80-hour work weeks every single week or 100-hour work weeks. I truly hope that.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Totally. And I think similar, not studies, but observations have been made with people close to death, and they have been asked those questions. And what were the priorities in life? And the priority was not work. The priority was relationships, maintaining relationships, and getting the fundamentals right. And I think we get it because when you do spend time with family, there's a sense of comfort in that, and there's a sense of belonging in it. Whereas when it's go, 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 it's almost that your attention is consumed by work. And there's something amiss there. And, it would be very interesting in terms of like all of the science that's abounding now with heart rate variability and gadgets, is to go into the Amazon and to find a tribal group which has been untouched, if such a group exists, untouched by modernization, and measure their data.
Here we go. Next Hanu health research
And
study. Here we go.
so, yeah, that's the
Yeah,
next quest.
indeed. Because you predict that because of maybe, I won't say the lack of evolution, but I would say maybe the lack of distraction. Would you predict that these individuals would have more resilient nervous systems, or would you predict something different?
Oh, I would without a doubt say that they are more
Yeah, I
resilient.
would say so too.
They're close to nature. They're naturally earthing. They're eating natural foods. They're breathing unpolluted air. They're in an environment whereby you can guarantee that they are not working 8 hours a day. They are working whatever they need to survive, to get food, etc. And there's a sense of belonging. And, really, that's what any person is looking for.
I totally agree. And, it's one of those things that, like, I mean, these are people who are living truly like our ancestors, where it's like, are they experiencing, the stressor of potentially like having to, let's say, look for food and maybe not find it. And so they're going some time without food. Absolutely. Is that a stressor? Yes, but it's an acute transient stressor. Is there the potential of, so we talked about famine. Is there a potential of, like getting bit by a snake in the Amazon and dying, or like being attacked by a mountain lion, or whatever, wherever the person's at, whatever the threat they have? There is. But again, that's what our ancestors lived with. There are these transient acute stressors. They're not these long-term chronic stressors that really, like, over time have such a detrimental
Yeah.
compounding effect. And I think it's a huge distinction for us to make. So I would absolutely agree with you. Like, these individuals feeling a sense of belonging, being a part of their tribe, is something that I actually try to take the mentality of my own family and then with kind of my social group as well. And Ben Greenfield talks about this a lot, and we talk about this a lot on his podcast, of like, there is probably no greater feeling than when you truly feel like a part of a tribe. Like when you truly feel like a sense of belonging, like these are my people, not to the exclusion or inclusion of who's in it or who's not in it, but just feeling that sense of like, I am actually like a part of something. That brings such fulfillment. And so if people can get back to that, because I feel like we have lost some connection, but we're learning about how great that is for our overall sense of mental health and physical health, like that will help to solve so many health problems in today's day and age. It's just like, even if we threw away, I mean, and again, like, I'm not telling people to do this, but if we threw away, like, all the sense of like heart rate variability training, even breath work, even like anything, and we just said, I want to get back just to kind of one core value, which is being a part of a social tribe, I think that's like the best place to start.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe you disagree with that.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with it. And just as you were talking there, I was only thinking, like, I have an 11-year-old kid, and we play an Irish game. It's called hurling,
Not curling like the
Hurling.
Canadians do.
And no, it's a game that's played by sticks. It's an ancient game. It was played over about 2,000 years ago. And she's on a pitch, and it's a grass. It's the fastest field sport, I think, on earth. But she's got a sense of community. She's a young kid with 14 other kids, and there's that teamwork. They'll get hit by the ball, so they'll get, unfortunately or fortunately not too injured. But there's disappointments, there's triumphs, there's good days, there's bad days, there's teamwork, there's that solidarity, there's support there. And it's almost as if the sports and religion and organizations and different things of today is replicating the social grouping and gatherings of the past. And as I said earlier on, maybe sports is one of the key features for growing kids, and also for the parents, because I feel there's a sense of solidarity then when you're bringing your kid to the sport and you're watching them evolve. And the other thing about this is that children will get bullied in school generally and very often. But if a young kid is able to excel in a particular field, they always will have that inner strength. That they have this inner strength that regardless of what's happening on the outside, they know themselves, that they know that they have been capable, that they have been able to achieve, that they have done well in a certain area. And that inner strength can provide a resolve regardless of what's happening on the outside. But if there's a kid who's solely entrapped with information technology and that's their world, do they have the inner strength to be able to cope with the trials and tribulations of everyday life? And it's all part of growing up. We all got bullied growing up. That's inevitable. And there's always these tough nuts of kids. And I always, like, when I think back of my own life, and anybody, I'm sure, look at the people who did the bullying to you, and 30 years and 40 years on, look at them and watch that space. And this is a marathon. So if you're a young kid or a teenager that feels you're at the wrong end, in terms of getting bullied, don't worry about it. This too will
Yeah, no,
pass.
indeed. Great words of wisdom. One of the most, famous psychologists in the world, his name's Alfred Adler. He came up with this idea that, especially as kids, and even as adults, we're all striving to avoid a sense of inferiority, because nobody wants to feel inferior. And so when we're bullied, especially as kids, like, we feel inferior. We feel like we can't protect ourselves. And a lot of times then we go and engage in things that are almost like outlets, they're escapes. And one of the big ways that people are doing this right now, we've mentioned it a couple of times, is engaged in like information technology and technology in regards to social media. And we lose our sense of independent thinking. We lose our sense of autonomy. And that's a really dangerous place to be. So the challenge right now is, how can we help individuals, especially young kids, to develop that sense of inner strength, that sense of autonomy and independence, and not just us, especially me, I'm thinking as a parent, like kind of almost like bullying them around, telling them what to do and what not to do, where they don't have kind of their ability to like think for themselves and think like, is this something that is, is this decision something that actually makes sense? Does it benefit me and benefit somebody else and not hurt somebody else? And so, again, I think it's just kind of worth us as adults kind of looking into that too. Like, where are our escapes that we're, kind of engaging in? Where are we kind of like leaving other areas of life, and we're kind of like relinquishing our sense of self-thinking and autonomy and independence, because we're trying to fill a void because we feel inferior. So yeah, again, I could derail us on this for an hour. People came to this and like, I thought you guys were like the HRV breathing like Q&A podcasts, like people, you guys are over here talking about meaning and purpose and life, and I'm like, yeah, this is the stuff that matters. That true, everything matters. I'm not saying that what we don't talk, the other things that we talk about, that they don't matter, but this stuff really matters. So yeah, Patrick, great thoughts of words, the great words of wisdom and thoughts here. I think I was trying to see if we could have like a really good transition from this to, our upcoming discussion
The
to
HRV.
HRV CO2 questions. Yeah, we'll see. So what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of like say, all right, table that for the next time that we meet. We'll continue the conversation and get more into the, discussions for today. So we're like 22 minutes in. And if anybody is joining us for the very first time, again, you got Dr. Jay Wiles here, Patrick McKeown, Oxygen Advantage. We meet every single month for these Q&As where we actually answer listener questions. You guys submit it to us either through email or on Instagram or other social media outlets. And if we choose kind of your question, we just go ahead and talk about them and answer them kind of the best that we can. So before we do that, Patrick and I usually banter like we did, for 23 minutes. But we're also going to kind of just open up a subject matter before we get to the Q&A that a lot of people have asked about. And I think that I wanted to talk with you about it, Patrick, because this is an area of expertise for you. But also, too, the one thing that I love is that you're able to kind of boil down the science and physiology of what I'm about to mention here into just really easy, understandable bites. And that's the role of CO2. Like, so many people still like either message me or they'll email me and they're like, I don't understand. Like, I still kind of have this notion that CO2 is just kind of like this off gassing, this waste gas, like kind of really only there as something that can like kind of complete the circle of life, because most people understand that plants thrive off of CO2. We produce it, and plants produce oxygen, and we thrive off oxygen. But they don't really understand, like, how can CO2 actually have like an operational role in health? And so what I figured would be really good idea is for you and I just to unpack, and maybe even more so you, because I know this is down, your lane, like, what is the role of CO2? Like, why do we even talk about CO2 being so important? So I think maybe it would be best, Patrick, if we just kind of unpacked it and talk about what CO2 actually is. And then, like, when it comes to breath work, when it comes to overall health, like, why is it even of concern? Why are we not just like talking about oxygen? So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I think it's I would agree with you. Most people are pretty much dumbfounded when they hear that carbon dioxide it's could you regard it as a nutrient absolutely essential to life. And when we break down just the basic physiology of it, and this is just normal physiology, what does carbon dioxide do? How do we generate carbon dioxide? Do we breathe in carbon dioxide? What's driving our breathing? So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, even though people talk about, greenhouse gas, etc., it's 0.04% of atmospheric pressure. And if we think of the atmosphere at sea level, it's 760 millimeters of mercury. And of that, oxygen is 21%. So oxygen is 21% of the atmosphere. And at sea level, the atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters. And carbon dioxide is 0.04% of that. The human lungs, and the theory is that the human lungs evolved in a period of high carbon dioxide, that plant life was so abundant, and the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere millions of years ago was in the tens of percent, but now it's fundamentally different and it's down to 0.01%.
Do you think that
But
has
during the
had some
evolution of
pretty
the
like
human,
negative ramifications for us as humans, or do you think we just have evolved to kind of deal with those conditions?
I think we've adapted, like we've done pretty well. We've got this
Yeah,
far.
exactly. Right.
So, and it's like in terms of carbon dioxide then as well, like how do we generate it? We generate it from our metabolism. So we don't breathe it in. We produce it in the body itself. Now, this is where our ancestors would have fared better because our ancestors would have been nasal breathers and they would have been doing a lot of physical exercise all day long because they were doing manual toil. They weren't talking all day the way we are. They weren't sitting down behind desks. They weren't under chronic stress. They naturally would have had a very good tolerance towards carbon dioxide because if you do physical exercise with your mouth closed, you feel an increased sensation of air hunger. And the reason being is because your nose imposes a resistance to your breathing that's 2.5 times that of the mouth during wakefulness. And because your nose is a smaller entry and exit, air cannot leave the body so quickly through the nose as through the mouth. So carbon dioxide increases in the blood, you feel air
And just
hunger.
to point out too,
But
and
when
again,
you
I'll link all of the stuff that we talk about in today's show notes over at hanuhealth.com/podcast. But we did answer a question too on this last, I think it was a last Q&A where we talked about kind of the role of nasal breathing only, especially like should we inhale through the nose and exhale through the nose? And one of the points that you made there is again, like it's really great, especially if we're working on CO2 pooling and increasing CO2 tolerance to breathe from the nasal, breathe in through the nasal pathway and out through the nasal pathway so that you can enhance that level of tolerance to CO2. So I just wanted to mention that just in case people wanted to take a more of a deep dive into kind of like why should we only breathe nasally. Last podcast. Go for it, Patrick.
And then again, if we have so people might be asking, like, why should we have an improved or a good tolerance towards carbon dioxide? It's because carbon dioxide is the primary stimulus to breathe. So you can imagine that you've got carbon dioxide coming from the tissue into the blood. And as carbon dioxide is coming into the blood, that blood then is brought back to the heart and back to the lungs where excess CO2 is exhaled. And that's the key that people probably think, that because we breathe out excess CO2, that carbon dioxide then is the waste gas. But then we have to ask, well, what's left behind? What's left in the lungs? And how much carbon dioxide should be in the body? So normal carbon dioxide in the blood and in the lungs, and under normal circumstances, it's the pressure of carbon dioxide in the lungs that determines the pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood. So we said that 0.04% is the pressure of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The pressure of carbon dioxide in the lungs and blood should be 5%. So there's a huge difference between 0.04% versus 5%. And we're talking about 5% of atmospheric pressure. So we produce carbon dioxide internally, but if we have a habit of breathing too hard and too fast, and it's not just about having a fast respiratory rate, it's the volume of air we breathe.
Mm.
It's the respiratory rate multiplied by the depth of breathing to give us minute ventilation. And it's the volume of air we breathe that determines carbon dioxide in the lungs and blood. And if we have a habit of breathing a little bit too much air, that in turn will get rid of too much carbon dioxide from the blood through the lungs. Carbon dioxide levels are lower. And what does carbon dioxide do? What are some of the signs, the everyday signs that we are lower in carbon dioxide? And it is a little bit, there's some anomalies here as well. This is not just so clear cut either. But I'll go through it and I'll kind of explain the
Mm.
anomalies. When, for example, we breathe too much, we get rid of too much carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide relaxes smooth muscle throughout the body. And smooth muscle is embedded in the blood vessels and airways and many of the organs as well. So if you breathe hard, your blood vessels constrict. So it's very common for people who breathe hard to have cold hands and cold feet. And also associate with that, the harder you breathe, the less blood flow reaches the brain.
Mm.
So back in 1983, there was a researcher called McKeown, and his conclusion was that every 1 millimeter drop of CO2 reduces blood flow to the brain by
Oh, wow.
2%. So how easy is it to get rid of carbon dioxide from the body? It's very easy. If I asked you to take full big breaths for 1 minute, that's all it takes. 1 minute of full big breaths, you can reduce carbon dioxide in the blood by half. So you could reduce it from normal of 40 millimeters of mercury down to 20. 1 minute of hard hyperventilation can reduce blood flow to the brain by up to
Mm.
40%. Now, what happens then when the brain isn't getting sufficient blood flow and oxygen delivery? Brain cells become excitable. So it increases agitation of the mind. And since 1924, carbon dioxide was seen as a tranquilizer. Now, of course, it's not quite a tranquilizer. It was also labeled as a narcotic gas, but it certainly has a relaxant effect on the human body and
Is
mind.
this why, Patrick?
So the
Is this why,
brain,
Patrick? When some people engage in, let's say, different breathwork strategies, especially ones that are enhancing sympathetic arousal, like expelling a lot of air in a really quick period of time, like I hear a lot of reports of people saying, like they start to feel like agitated, they start to feel a little bit anxious. First, and but then some people will say, like I start feeling like really relaxed, and a lot of times they'll follow it up with like breath holds, like they'll expel a lot of air and then they breath hold, like do you happen to know why or have any idea why there are some people that like will feel, I think you kind of explained it, will feel agitated when they do it, but then some people are just like, oh no, man, it feels like really relaxing, because from a physiological standpoint, it doesn't seem to make sense why it would like help to engage a relaxation response unless something is going on differently, maybe the pooling of CO2 after, let's say, like a breath hold, which I can talk about here in a second, can increase parameters of HRV and vagal tone. Like it's just kind of a little bit confusing to a lot of people. So I didn't know if you wanted to shed any light, and then we'll kind of jump back to where you were.
I think the effect is genetic.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I ask 10 people to hyperventilate, people are going to be affected differently. 2 days ago, we had an instructors meeting, and one of the instructors is an Italian
Mm-hmm.
psychologist, and he's working with a client at the moment. The client did hyperventilation for 1 full hour when he was 20 years of age. So hyperventilation for 1 full hour has some breathwork
Mm.
practices, and he developed spasms in the face and throat and tongue facial tics. They have been ongoing for 5 years,
Oh wow.
and not everybody will develop that. And
Was
here's
that
the
kind of like
strange thing: we
holotropic
cannot
breathing
always
that he was
predict.
doing, or?
That was
Okay,
exactly what
yeah.
he was
Jeez.
doing, and that's what caused it. And I wasn't going to name it, but
I'll do it.
so he then he came across Breathe Light then, and he's making some progress with that. So I suppose we have to bear in mind that we're all different, and even when we are working with people with different complaints and panic disorder and anxiety, you know, it be that people with a tendency towards panic and anxiety, that when they hyperventilate, they have a significantly stronger vasoconstriction effect. In other words, reduced blood flow going to the brain than others.
Mm-hmm.
And they have also a different tolerance to carbon dioxide. And for example, I put people into panic attacks by having them breathe less air. And my intention was to have them breathe less air to improve blood flow to the brain, have them do some breath holds to increase blood flow to the brain, to have a calming effect. So, Jay, one lesson that I've taken out of all of this working with people is we go easy. and
Yeah.
we gently develop people's tolerance to it, because sometimes we don't know how a person is going to react. Like, I remember having a footballer in. This guy was about 6'2", big guy, 20 years of age, and I had him with a small group workshop of about 5 or 6 people, going through the exercises, and he started crying in the
Mm,
class. Now, not too many 20-year-olds. It must take a bit to push him, because this guy is not a walkover.
sure.
This guy is well able to tolerate. He's tough. But yet, what I did was the exercises obviously had a stronger effect on him because of his background of panic
Mm,
disorder. So, now we start off so easy, because you never know where you are at in terms of
yeah.
breath work. And if you start off very gentle, you can gently increase the tolerance, or not, gently increase the dose of the air hunger and the duration of the air hunger, to find where is that person is
Yeah.
at. And ultimately, we want to challenge a little bit, but we don't want to push people over. Now, I don't think people truly realize the power of the breath. And it took me a long time, and as I said, I've made plenty of mistakes. But when it comes back to carbon dioxide, and people talk about carbon dioxide, breathe in as much oxygen as possible and get rid of as much carbon dioxide as possible, it's not taking into consideration the role of carbon dioxide
Mm-hmm.
as a vasodilator,
Mm, mm-hmm.
increasing blood flow and improving blood circulation throughout the body. It's not taking into consideration that when you breathe in oxygen into the lungs, oxygen is passing from the lungs into the blood, and 98.5% of oxygen is carried in the blood bound by
Mm,
hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is a protein in the red blood cell. How does hemoglobin release oxygen to the tissues and organs? And one factor that causes that release is an increase of carbon dioxide and a resultant drop in blood
mm-hmm.
pH. So, if we are breathing too hard and we are getting rid of too much carbon dioxide, there is a curve called the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And you will find this if you put it into Google. And if you breathe too hard and you're losing too much carbon dioxide from the blood through the lungs, which you can do in about 30 to 60 minutes of hyperventilating, the curve shifts to the left, and hemoglobin holds on to oxygen more
Mm,
readily. So hard breathing is not only causing blood vessels to constrict, but is also causing less oxygen to be delivered throughout the
mm-hmm.
body. Now, as a result, when we breathe hard, the fraction of expired oxygen is greater. So literally, when we breathe hard, we're taking in a lot of oxygen into the lungs, into the blood. That oxygen does a round trip, and then we exhale that oxygen back out again. So there's so much oxygen in the human body that even during fairly intense physical exercise, we still have about 25%, our oxygen, there's a huge reservoir, if I was to use that word, that it's very unlikely that, if you go for a sprint with your mouth closed, your blood oxygen saturation will drop down to maybe about
Mm-hmm.
91%. You're barely
Yep.
hypoxic. If you do a sprint with the mouth open, your blood oxygen saturation drops down to about 94%. You're not even in hypoxia. In other words, you can really push the body hard, and you will hardly affect oxygen in the blood.
Mm,
But yet, when people feel that strong air hunger, what is causing that? Well, that's going to be caused because of an increase in metabolic activity, which is generating carbon dioxide, dropping blood pH, and the brain is reacting to the change in blood pH by sending an increased stimulus to breathe. Now, here's the crux of it. Some people are overly sensitive to the accumulation of carbon dioxide, and these can be people with, increased breathlessness during physical exercise, sleep apnea. 30% of the sleep apnea population have what's called high loop gain, and that can be assessed by using breath hold time during wakefulness. And if they have a low breath hold time during wakefulness, it can provide an indicator of your sensitivity to carbon dioxide buildup. And ultimately, it's your breathing during wakefulness that will determine your breathing during
mm-hmm.
sleep. And it's your breathing even during rest that determines your breathing during physical
Mm-hmm.
exercise. So, we're all different.
Right.
And I had cold hands and feet for many, many years as a result of hyperventilation. I had brain fog, undiagnosed sleep apnea, difficulty concentrating, difficulty focusing. But the person next to me may have had just as dysfunctional breathing as myself, but mightn't have had those symptoms.
Right.
That's the difference when it comes to the
Yeah.
breath.
No, that's great information. Thanks for taking that deep dive into CO2 and really illustrating just kind of the diversity of effect of CO2. One of the things that, I love that you mentioned is that it operates as a vasodilator. I mean, the other thing too, which you mentioned, which was explaining the Bohr effect so eloquently, is that CO2, and again, I don't know if I've heard you mention it this way, Patrick, or if this is just kind of the way I've been always kind of conceptualized it the first time I heard it. CO2 almost seems to act like a key, just kind of similar to like insulin does. So, like insulin is a key that drives sugar into cells from the blood in order to be utilized. CO2 sounds like it's a key. It locks in, and then now you're able to deliver and utilize oxygen way more effectively. It is the way to deliver and utilize oxygen. Is that a good analogy or comparison, or are there some nuances that I'm missing there?
No, it's pretty spot on. If we look at a quotation by John West, he's a respiratory physiologist. He's very well regarded in terms of respiration, and a lot of doctors will read his
Mm-hmm.
book to get an insight into respiratory health. And his quotation is that an exercising muscle is hot and hypercapnic. And an exercising muscle, by becoming hot and hypercapnic, will receive more
Mm-hmm.
oxygen. So, in very simple terms, what this means is if you go for a jog, the muscles that you're going to work the hardest are the leg
Mm-hmm.
muscles. But how do those leg muscles get more oxygen? Because you need to get oxygen to the muscles that are working the
Exactly.
hardest. So how do those working muscles get that oxygen? Well, the hotter the muscle becomes, that causes a right shift of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And also, an exercising muscle is generating and producing more carbon dioxide, which is causing a right shift.
Mm.
So, I suppose for people to remember it, that yeah, oxygen isn't delivered equally throughout the
Yep.
body, and the muscles that need it the most get the most oxygen. But for those muscles to get the more oxygen, they become hotter and hypercapnic. And hypercapnic means producing more carbon dioxide.
Yes.
But here's another question. If you have an athlete with disproportionate breathlessness during physical exercise, so say we have an athlete or we have a recreational, normal individual, sleeping with the mouth open, breathing hard and fast all night long, we'd say maybe with a tendency towards anxiety or panic disorder or asthma, because these groups are more prone to dysfunctional
Mm-hmm.
breathing. That person, their breathing during rest is faster and harder. That individual then does physical exercise. And during physical exercise, they have disproportionate breathing. So, for the given intensity of physical exercise, their breathing is too hard and too fast, which is causing too much carbon dioxide to be removed from the body. What's that doing then in terms of aerobic capacity
Yeah.
and getting more oxygen
Yeah.
to the
Try
working
that down.
muscles? And in an extreme example, think of people with chronic fatigue syndrome. They go for a walk for maybe 20 minutes and they've such lactic acid as a result of it that they have to go back to bed for about two
Mm-hmm.
hours. That's just one example. And can we change that? Yes, we can.
Yeah, no, it's really intriguing. It's one of the things, like I don't think we have to make too much of a pitch for like exercise, but one of the things that we might need to make a pitch for that you've mentioned here just now is that if we there's a translative effect. So the way that we're breathing at a normal resting condition tends to translate into how we breathe dysfunctionally or functionally when we're engaging in exercise. So if we can actually train ourselves through breathwork techniques, through the things that you and I speak about and preach about a lot on this podcast, then we can then see a translative effect over to exercise, that kind of good carryover effect. And I'm kind of vice versa. Like for me, I'm trying to be as cognizant and as aware as I can of my breathing and resting conditions. And then also too, I do it when in a physical exercise capacity as well. Like breathing during exercise is a little bit more difficult, especially if you're doing nasal only, than breathing at rest. However, it becomes a hell of a lot easier if you're practicing it at rest and then seeing that translating or translative effect when you're exercising. So yeah, no, it's a really valuable point. So kind of as we wrap this up, Patrick, any other thoughts kind of on CO2? Hopefully we've kind of like helped to remove any stigma or demonization that people have had on CO2. I mean, a lot of our listeners are going to already know that it's not kind of like this evil thing that's there, but it's just really important to kind of realize that if we want to be able able to utilize oxygen more effectively in the muscles that need it at that time, then we need to be able to kind of utilize and become more tolerant to CO2 first. Because without CO2, oxygen is not going to operate. Well, I mean, it's not going to operate at all, but it's not going to operate nearly as efficiently if we have a dysfunction in our tolerance level to CO2. Anything else you would add?
I think the best way is to practice it.
Yep.
We can talk all the theory in the world.
Like that.
One of the things that really made, there's bound to be people listening here that have cold hands and cold feet, and maybe they just accept it as being, well, that's the way they are. But the next time that they have 5 minutes to spare, sit down and bring your attention out of your mind onto your breathing, and really slow down the speed of the breath in, almost that your breath in is imperceptible. So you're taking such a soft, gentle breath into the nose, and then you're having a really, really relaxed and a slow and a prolonged exhalation. And the objective is to breathe less air. And by breathing less air, carbon dioxide increases in the blood. And you know that carbon dioxide is increasing when you feel air hunger, because the primary stimulus to breathe is carbon dioxide. And the body is very sensitive to an accumulation of carbon dioxide. So practice breathing less air for a period of 3 minutes. And see, can you influence the blood circulation in your fingers? Can you bring a feeling of increased temperature into the hands? And on that, if you're wondering then what's going on, I'm sure you realize by now that's due to an increase of carbon dioxide, and that's what carbon dioxide does. And it's not that we want to expose the body to dangerously high carbon dioxide levels. No, not at all. We were talking the first 20 minutes, we went off on a complete tangent about modern living versus our ancestors, this, that, and the other. And think about our modern living. Think about the chronic stress. Think about the talking all day. How many of you talk for a living? And you're absolutely exhausted at the end of the day talking. When you talk, or when I talk, of course, our breathing is going to get faster and harder. But it's not accompanied by an increase in metabolic activity. It's normal to breathe harder and faster when you are exercising your muscles. But if you're talking all day, your breathing is going to be slightly harder and you're breathing more air. And at the end of the day, you're exhausted. And could that be due to reduced blood flow and oxygen delivery to the brain, causing fatigue? Yeah. So breathe less for a short period of time and see, can you influence your blood circulation? And bear in mind, there are 70,000 miles of blood vessels throughout the human body. You can influence your blood circulation, but not just that. There are so many organs in the human body that have smooth muscle embedded in those organs. And maybe this is why that when we get into a stressful situation, what's it doing to the body? Well, when we get stressed and we have a difficult situation, and if we respond by hyperventilating, we are breathing too much air. And too much air getting rid of too much carbon dioxide from the blood. Blood vessels constrict. There's reduced blood flow going to the brain. Organs are constricting. Airways are constricting. And this can be part of the fight or flight response. So it's going back to the next time we get into a difficult situation, don't respond by hyperventilating. Understand that if you hyperventilate, it's not going to help you in this situation.
Yeah, indeed. Great words of wisdom. This is my opportunity to provide a shameless plug that if anybody is not following the Hanu Health waitlist and you're not, part of it, please do. And the reason I say that is, again, because, this is a podcast and I can plug it if I want, but it's also to say that, again, our goal in creating what we're creating in health technology is to help people become more aware. And one of the things that we see, even just preliminary in some of the stuff that we've built, is that when heart rate variability drops and people check in subjectively, one of the things that they'll always, not always, but one of the things that they will typically notice is that their pattern of breathing has become pretty dysfunctional. It could be that they're breathing from the mouth, or they're just having more labored, shallow breathing. They're breathing really fast. They're off-gassing a lot of CO2. And because of that, you're going to see kind of this shift in nervous system functioning. You're going to see a heightened increase in sympathetic drive, and you're going to see a relinquishing of vagal brake. Why? Because the body is perceiving that in that moment, you must be kind of like about to be attacked by a mountain lion, or something's happening to to you. You just, drink something toxic, maybe not that extreme, but the body it's protecting you. It's all about self-preservation. So what do we do about it? Like if we become more self-aware, well, then we self-regulate it. We send a different signal. We slow our breathing down. We breathe really lightly. I talked about with David Jackson here recently on a podcast, and he was all about kind of, again, this concept of LSD breathing. It's, again, we have to remember, and go listen to that podcast. We'll link that in the show note. But the thing is here too, is that we always have the opportunity to send a direct message and a different message at any moment. You just have to first be conscientious of it. You have to be self-aware of it. And that's what Hanu is really trying to help people do, is to become more self-aware of that. But in the end, kind of what it comes down to, though, is once we do become self-aware, we just latch on to the lowest hanging fruit, something that is so simple, it's non-invasive, it's a part of who we are as human beings, which is low, slow breathing and not off gassing as fast as we can as much air, as much CO2, because we know, as what you've mentioned here, Patrick, before, is that can have some serious detrimental effects and will translate into other areas of life and will make you more anxious. It will make you more stressed because the body's receiving that signal. And the body's very sophisticated, the brain is very sophisticated, but also too, like, it can be a little bit myopic at times when it receives these different messaging signals from the body. Like, it doesn't, again, know the difference between, the mountain lion that's around the corner per se, compared to, like, you getting a scathing email from your employer, or you like having a fight with your husband or your wife. Like, these are things, again, just to find and to be considerate of. So I'm going to go ahead and shift us over to the Q&A now, Patrick, but thanks again for explaining in such great detail kind of the role of CO2 kind of in all areas. And I'm sure we'll explore more here soon. Were you going to say something?
Can I just bring you back a little bit, Jay? In terms of self-awareness, how would one know if they're self-aware? I think there's a lot of lack of awareness out there.
Absolutely.
That people are naturally very stuck in their mind. So how could we decide? How would I know if I'm self-aware? Is it because I'm taking my attention out of my mind into the body? And because I'm holding my attention there, that I can pick up quicker when I'm under stress, because I can feel the tension there. Mm-hmm. But if we're caught up in day-to-day living and all of our focus is in our head and we're putting our attention outwards, because most of our attention is going outwards, very seldom do we bring our attention inwards. And I think females I think they are more self-aware. I think they are more in tune with their body than men. I think men's analytical capacity, I don't know, maybe I'm totally wrong there.
You're definitely right. Yeah.
So to become self-aware, what would be a practice for somebody who isn't self-aware? Would it be just to tune in every now and again, just to take their attention out of their body, and just even to put their attention into their hand and hold their attention there, and to feel what's the temperature of the air around the hand, what bodily sensations are there? Maybe bring attention as far as their elbow. And again, they're taking attention into the body and then over to the shoulder, across the chest, into the abdomen. And it's a very useful thing to do. We talk about breath aware, but body awareness, that if you go for a walk, don't just go for a walk with your head, dispersing attention throughout the body, that you can pick up on things. Do you think people sometimes naturally do this, or is this something that we have to train?
I think that we do have this naturally built into us, but because of such a high level of compounding stress, we move away from it and we lose that connection. So the scientific term, if anybody is wondering, is a term called interoception. And interoception is all about being able to identify how our body is manifesting and responding to what's going on within our environment. So for instance, interoception would be able to connect with your breathing without you having to conscientiously say, I'm going to now connect with my breathing. That's a great way to do it initially. But the more and more we condition that response, the more and more we naturally become more in tune with that. Another one would be heart rate. So kind of even being able to feel that sensation of a heart rate increase or decrease. Some people are really good at that, and some people used to be really good at that and maybe aren't so great because things divert our attention. We say, oh, well, I don't have time to deal with my stress because I don't really know what to do with it right now. So what do? We just kind of take it, we compress it, we bottle it up. Another really big one would be one that you mentioned before, which is muscular tension. And for for males, this happens a lot. Tension in the traps, tension in the shoulders, tension in the chest. So interoception would be all about like, how can I use all of these signals? Because these are signals within the body. Our body it wants to save us. Like it wants to self-preserve. It does not want us to be eaten by the mountain lion. It does not want us to be attacked by work. Like it wants us to thrive. So it will send these signals. We just have to tune into them. And it's going to be different for everybody, right, Patrick? For me, I am so in tune with my heart rate, like very interoceptive to my heart rate, because I've done a lot of training in heart rate variability so that I know, like, I don't even have to place my fingers. Like if anybody's watching this on video, I don't have to place my fingers on my carotid artery. Like I just feel it. And that, again, that takes time. I think what I've noticed, which is really interesting in working with kids, is kids, they have not been tainted by a lot of the stressors and compounding stressors of life. Most of them, not all of them. I mean, people grow up differently. But one thing that they're really good at is being very interoceptive. But a lot of the adults that I meet, especially middle-aged adults, are really bad at interoception. They don't notice when their heart rate's increasing. They don't notice the amount of muscular tension. They don't notice them breathing up, thoracically or even clavically, like in their shoulders. Like they just don't notice it. So a lot of it is finding ways to, number one, be very conscientious of it. And you have to use your volition to kind of focus in on that. But then again, the more you do it, just like any principle in psychology, the more you're going to condition a response so that you don't have to think as much conscientiously about it. It just happens. Like your attention's just drawn to it. So like if I'm stressed, yes, I love the idea of leveraging technology to look at heart rate variability during the day. But I also too, if I'm stressed, like I will just feel it. Like I'll feel it in my heart. And I know that might sound like a little bit like esoteric or nebulous, but it's not. Like I like literally feel my heart rate change. So it's a lot of it's just being kind of, taking the time to condition the response to be self-aware to those small little things that seem micro, but they're actually macro. They are signaling systems. And if we view them as signaling systems that are there to help prevent injury and to save us, then I think it's a better way of conceptualizing like why it would be important to tune into those things throughout the day. Does that make sense on how I explain that?
Yeah,
Okay.
totally. We should be calling it The Lost Art of Self-Awareness.
I love it. It's our new book. We'll have to bring James and Nestor on there. He talked about the lost art of breathing.
That's
and
it.
Now we can all three write a book on the lost art of self-awareness. And it's huge, though. No, it's true. All right, Patrick. Well, I know we are deep into this thing and haven't gotten to Q&A now, but so I'll shift us over there. So today maybe we'll get to one or two questions. Again, like hopefully like people have found this to be extremely useful and practical. I think that we're pretty, fun people to listen to, but I don't know if people want to listen to 2.5 hours. So, we'll probably try to keep it no more than like 90 minutes. Well, let's go ahead now and shift over to Q&A. Does that sound good with you, Patrick?
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, so this is the part of the show where we have our listener Q&A, and our listener Q&A again comes from our listeners. So if you're interested in having Patrick answer one of your questions, it's pretty simple. You just email us podcast@hanuhealth.com. That's podcast@hanuhealth.com. And if we choose your question, we're getting a lot of questions, by the way, Patrick. If we choose your question and it seems like it's one that either we haven't answered or we need to kind of be a little bit more nuanced with, then we'll put it on here and we will mention your name. We won't mention your full name. We won't mention your name. So that's one way to do it. It's probably the easiest way. You can also send us a direct message on Instagram at Hanu Health. At Hanu Health is our Instagram account or handle. And then we will love to kind of hear from you there. So let's go to our first question, which comes from Melissa. Actually, Melissa was a question we were going to get to last time we had the podcast, but we didn't. So I shifted her question up to number one. So Melissa, this is for you. And she asked, what is the best breathwork pattern for increasing HRV? Should I focus on exhales over inhales? So I really like this question, again, because it's kind of like in my alley in terms of HRV and HRV biofeedback. But I also like this question because, it's always funny, Patrick. And again, I'm not making fun of you, Melissa, so please don't take it that way. I love your question. Is when people always ask that word or they preface it with like best. Like, what is the best practice? And I would say that for you and I, we're probably going to say, like, I don't know. I don't know what the best is for you. Like, I know what the best is for me because I've utilized a lot of different strategies and I've tested it. But best is just one of those words that, like, I try to remove that. So I kind of say, like, what does the research say about the most advantageous ways of raising HRV? And I'm just going to give some of my preliminary thoughts, and then I'll punt it over to you for what your thoughts are, especially when we talk about kind of like extending exhalations versus inhalations. So, one of the things that we actually know from research, especially from a guy out of Rutgers University, this is a professor emeritus. His name is Dr. Paul Lehrer. And he actually he's kind of spent his life researching kind of different breathwork patterns and more or less the pacing of breathing for heart rate variability and how it affects heart rate variability. So just kind of really quickly, if anybody's not familiar, there are two predominant influences of heart rate variability. One would be something called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is the changes of heart rate across the respiratory cycle. And the more change you have in the heart rate across the respiratory cycle, that's usually indicative of a higher HRV. The other thing that's a major contributor is something called the baroreflex mechanism. And I've talked about that a few times in the podcast, so I'm not going to go too deep. But basically, this is a homeostatic mechanism for maintaining blood pressure throughout the system, throughout the body. And we know that when people engage their parasympathetic nervous system, predominantly through breathing and changing the mechanics and the pacing of breathing, and even too, you could argue the chemistry of breathing, then that will significantly influence our means of managing a homeostatic blood pressure or that mechanism. So with that, what Dr. Paul Lehrer has done is he's looked at, are there rates of breathing that will typically influence heart rate variability more so than others? And the answer is that for most individuals, when we get their breathing rate down to, or breath rate down to about 6 breaths per minute, that this is going to be a pretty good sweet spot for most people. So he found that out and he said, okay, so 6 breaths per minute seems to really be kind of like more or less a universal way of raising HRV for a bulk majority of people. However, can we get a little bit more granular with that? Like, are there ways of enhancing HRV even in a more specific way for individuals? So can we make this basically bio-individual? And he found something called what he refers to as resonance breathing or resonant frequency breathing. And what he found through just among thousands of participants is that for most human adults, their resonant rate, and I'll explain that here in just a second, falls between 4.5 breaths per minute at the lowest to as high as 6.5 breaths per minute. So somewhere in between there, a bulk majority of adult humans will find that they can breathe at that rate, and it will have the highest degree of influence on heart rate variability or influence in the autonomic nervous system. The way you do that is simple yet not so simple. You have to go kind of through a series of tests at each breath cycle, each half breath from 6.5 all the way to 4.5, and look at a wide diversity of metrics within heart rate variability. You can look at Paul Lehrer's initial study on this. He's refined it throughout the years, which I think is great, that he just didn't like stick to his guns. He's like, no, this is the only way to do it. He's refined it and made it more granular and more specific, which is great. But the best way to do it right now is to go see a biofeedback therapist who knows how to run a resonant frequency evaluation or assessment. Now, if people just hold on and they follow Hanu Health, there might be some other ways coming down the pike where they can actually find this rate for themselves. But what I will say, and this is my long-winded answer of saying that if you're able to find that resonant rate for you, then that's probably going to be a good gauge for the pacing of breathing. And again, you and I and Patrick have talked about this before, about how biofeedback has done really like a lot of work in looking at changing the cadence of breathing, but really hasn't placed as much emphasis on the biomechanics and biochemistry of breathing. So for me, again, this is kind of a personal opinion, and then I'm going to punt it over to you. And I don't know necessarily I'd say an opinion. I think we could confound this in science, is that if you do find your resonant rate of breathing, so for me, 5 breaths per minute, and then you enhance your breathing mechanics and you enhance your breathing chemistry or your biochemistry, then that combination is what I have found to typically be the best pattern for me. And again, I think we're all, just organically built differently than one another. But for me, it is a matter of breathing LSD, now which we talked about again in the last podcast. So I'm not going to go too much into LSD breathing, but it's breathing LSD without the drugs or with the drugs. I don't know. Now I probably shouldn't say that. The investors of the company will be like, like, you guys are doing LSD there? No. So it's a combination of LSD breathing and then also too just following that resonant rate. And that can be a little bit tricky sometimes because for me, like breathing really lightly and then staying within that resonant rate is something that can be, it takes a little bit of practice and time. And what I've found too is that if I find that my body intuitively is just telling me like right now the resonant rate is not going to amplify kind of your subjective response to stress as much as you just kind of like staying slow in cadence, but not kind of like sitting on that 5 breaths per minute pacing, then I'll do it. I kind of really like to tune in intuitively because we have to remember that just because something can be objective doesn't mean that objective needs to be the only outlet. Like our subjective experience of how it feels in that moment is really important. So again, I'm going to hush up because that was a long-winded way of me kind of like my pitch for resonant breathing, my pitch for LSD breathing. What say you on that one, Patrick?
I think we should look at some fundamentals here. Melissa is asking, how do we optimize heart rate variability? Maybe stop doing some things that are causing it to be reduced. And one would be having sleep disorder breathing. And maybe here's a question, Jay, that if somebody has obstructive sleep apnea or heavy snoring or insomnia or upper airway resistance syndrome, and it has been shown in recent enough studies that especially with obstructive sleep apnea, that's when the individual either stops breathing wholly during sleep or they have a partial reduction in the flow of their breathing during sleep due to collapse of the upper airways, that this reduces heart rate variability. There must be some proportion of the population who have obstructive sleep apnea because it affects about 30% of men and it affects about 10% of females up to about 50 years of age. And then postmenopausal women, it multiplies by about 200, 300%.
That's crazy.
That one could have sleep disorder breathing, which is causing HRV to be reduced. And then they are practicing optimizing their breathing during the day, breathing at a cadence. So on one hand, they're making improvements, but on the other hand, their sleep is holding them back. And 50% of the adult population are waking up with a dry mouth in the morning. That is just our own observation over the last 20 years. How do we help to improve sleep? And getting the mouth closed and the tongue resting on the roof of the mouth and breathing in and out through the nose. And also using breath hold time during wakefulness as an indicator of functional breathing patterns. And I know we've spoken about this, but this also ties in with the sensitivity of the baroreflex. So we can get an indicator of the chemosensitivity of the body to carbon dioxide, which we've spoken about today. That individuals who are very sensitive to the accumulation of carbon dioxide typically will have a lower breath hold time. And when you have a lower breath hold time and you're overly sensitive to the body to carbon dioxide, so if you have, there's an inverse relationship. We want as a very sensitive baroreflex, but we want to reduce sensitivity to carbon dioxide. Individuals who are overly sensitive to carbon dioxide have a reduced sensitivity of the baroreflex, and vice versa. Individuals with a reduced sensitivity to carbon dioxide have an increased sensitivity of the baroreflex. That is there a way for people to bring it into their way of life, to adopt simple breathing strategies and awareness? Are they waking up with a dry mouth in the morning? Before they go to sleep, are they in hyperarousal? Are they looking at their screens? Or do they spend some time just down regulating? And like, it was really yourself that brought me into the whole significance of air hunger. And when we breathe light, that we are reducing the volume of air that we are breathing and the impact that that is having on HRV. While during the exercise, of course, the air hunger can initiate a small stress response. So HRV can drop during the exercise, but post-exercise, then you would expect HRV to come up. That there's different ways of doing it. And maybe the best way to do it is the way that we can incorporate into our way of life. So for Melissa too, would it make a difference if she was to do physical exercise with the mouth closed and there's going to be an increased carbon dioxide in the blood with nasal breathing versus mouth breathing? Can we stimulate the vagus nerve during physical exercise? Can we improve vagal tone and increase heart rate variability by breathing differently during physical exercise? Or do we have to be breathing during rest? It's an interesting
It
topic,
is.
really.
Yeah. No, it is. And, one of the things to kind of keep in mind, excuse me, and I love that you mentioned kind of like we think about kind of like what we're doing throughout the day and how that affects kind of overall nervous system resilience. HRV is a proxy of nervous system resilience in the human stress response. But if we don't take into consideration some of these other variables, like we don't take kind of like the broader lens, holistic, integrated perspective, and look at things like how sleep could impact it. I mean, we're talking about a third of our life here. This is a major category. Then we could be doing ourselves a huge disservice. So like, it's not going to, if anybody has any sleep related difficulties, and especially if they have something like sleep apnea or insomnia as well, like it's not saying that like, you shouldn't be doing breath work throughout the day because it's kind of going to go by the wayside. That's not the case. But what we are saying though is that there are some huge aspects of overall health and well-being, like including sleep, that do not need to be pushed aside. These are things that really need to be addressed. And if we want to optimize health and well-being, that's a really, really important category because, this goes back to the kind of what Hanu Health has identified as being the four pillars of health, right? It's like nutrition. What are we putting into our bodies? We look at sleep, we look at exercise and recovery, and then we look at stress. And those four components, and, you could, place some other things here and there, obviously, but we think those are four huge pillars of health that when one of them is kind of dysfunctional, it's going to impact all of them. But when all of them are kind of like in collaboration with one another, they're kind of working synergistically with one another, then that's when we can have an optimal sense of health. So sleep is an absolutely huge one that I feel like everybody kind of like conceptually knows, like it's really important to do, but then like actually like putting something into action is a little bit more difficult for people. But remember, this is a third of your life, and if we really want to dedicate a third of our life to improving health, then sleep has to be like the low hanging fruit that you can engage in. And so, like I think, kind of to your point, engaging in mouth taping, having really good pre-bed rituals, doing things that help to monitor sleep architecture and looking at heart rate variability fluctuation overnight. Like these are things that I feel like anybody should be engaging in if they're looking to maximize the benefit of their breathwork practice.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Um, just in that question, if one was to go for a walk with their mouth open, and mouth breathing is typically engaging more upper chest breathing and faster breathing rate, which is very normal with mouth breathing, would it increase sympathetic drive? I know with during physical exercise, it's a stress response involved anyway. That there's a paper that was written back in 1996 by Travis and Dulliard looking at flow states. And they found that individuals who did their physical exercise with the mouth closed, that they were more likely to achieve that coveted flow state, which could imply that there's a balance in the autonomic nervous system, that you're alert and you're relaxed at the same time, that you're fully immersed in the present moment, that the runner and the race become one, that there's no differentiation between the individual and the task at hand. That by changing our breathing during the task that we're already doing, and if we have the understanding, so we spoke about sleep, getting the mouth closed, having the tongue resting in the roof of the mouth can be very important as well because it helps open up the airways. Breathing through the nose during physical exercise, tapping into our breathing at different times during the day. It's kind of, I was reading a study yesterday, and it was a Belgian study, and it was looking at 51 business students and it was testing different breathing rates prior to making a difficult decision. So they divided the group of 51 students into two groups, and in one group they gave them a 5-2-7 breathing exercise. Breathe in for 5 seconds, hold for 2 seconds, and exhale for 7 seconds. The second group was gave sham, so placebo or control group. And the two groups then were put to a stressor. And it was the group who did the breathing exercises for only 2 minutes, Jay.
Wow.
2 minutes of breathing exercises, their business decision making increased.
Yeah.
And we were talking about this amongst our own instructors because you can imagine there's plenty of people who are in business, and the first thing that they're thinking to themselves, I don't have time to spend any time on my breathing. But if they realize that there's a good potential of making good, solid, or better decisions by bringing that balance to the nervous system,
Wow.
and it was in terms of increasing vagal tone. But there's different ways of doing it. What about the person who's going around with their mouth open all day? By getting them to breathe through their nose, the person who is conscious of breathing fast and hard, and they're just making a gentle and kind of taking attention onto their breathing. And every now and again, even for 90 seconds, they're taking a soft breath in, they're having a relaxed and a slow and gentle exhalation. In other words, is improving and optimizing heart rate variability. Is it the formal practice, or is it the everyday practice that we bring into our everyday life to develop that habit that it becomes
Yeah.
part of
Yeah.
us?
And I think it's both. I mean, I think it's really both. But the thing that people think is that they need to, or they have to devote kind of that time. And what that means though, is if they think that way, then they end up not doing it. And they end up not doing anything. Or it's like, no, let's kind of actually start with the framework of just doing small bits of it. And then if we need to or want to build in something formal, we do it. So I'm always kind of more of an advocate of like, let's build in what you can do throughout the day, just being more conscientious of breathing, increasing rate variability in a matter of 2 minutes, like you mentioned, because we can access that really quickly. And the more and more we train with it, and the more and more we do it on, let's say, more of an informal basis, we can still create a better level of awareness and strength and speed and increasing our response. Now, if we add in the formal practice on top of it, then that's kind of like I almost see like that as like the icing on top of the cake. But I realize too that as being kind of our first established place is probably not the best place to start. And the reason being, Patrick, is because I've seen this happen in mindfulness and meditation practices. People think, oh, well, the starting place is that you have to at least do, let's say, just even what's considered a short-term meditation, 10 to 15 minutes. That might still be too much for people. But what if we said, and I love this is Dan Harris's comment. Dan Harris he said, I start with 1 second. And I say, okay, I can do 1 second. And if after 1 second, I'm like, I can go more, maybe I'll take it to 5 seconds or 10 seconds. And that sounds kind of like I'm joking, but it's actually probably not that bad of a
That's
place.
cool. That's
Yeah,
great,
start
actually.
with 1 second. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, you want to argue with me that you can't do 1 second? Like, no, nobody can pull that. I don't care if you're Elon Musk and you're working whatever, 22 hours a day. You got 1 second that you could do it. And I think that's the better place to start. And what you find though is that people get more of a drive and a hunger for it because they're like, ooh, if this works like in the matter of a minute or 2 minutes, which is really short, what's going to happen if I really change things to 10 minutes, 15 minutes a day of formal practice? Like people just get really interested in it. I'm sure that's why a lot of people are drawn to like Oxygen Advantage as like instructors, is that, maybe they did start off with an hour long practice. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, probably not, but maybe, but it might just be like, oh, they, dip the feet in the water a little bit and they're all like, oh, this is pretty cool. I like this. And then they're like, okay, I got my toes in the water. Now let me go, ankle deep, calf deep, up to my waist. All right, now I'm in fully. Like I feel like I've drinking the Kool-Aid. And I think that that's just kind of a natural kind of human process. If we try to throw too much onto somebody at once, and you and I have talked about this before, then people are just like, nah, it's too much. I'm not going to do it. And so that's why so many people, and this is not for me to kind of like get at like, the meditation apps, but Calm and Headspace don't have a ton of people that start it, like finish off like their year of subscription, like still doing like 10, 15, 30-minute meditations each day. It just doesn't work that way. What you actually see is that their primary hits are like the 2-minute ones, like the 5-minute ones that really most people can build in. So sorry for my long, winded diatribe / soapbox on kind of, what we should do in terms of kind of like, breath work practices or kind of timing of practice. But I just think, again, like the best one for you is the one that you do. And we mentioned that last time. So yeah, I think it's a huge point. One thing I want to say, before we switch gears here to the next question, is that Melissa also asked about like focusing on exhales versus inhales. Like, should we kind of like change the timing up? One thing that I'll mention from a heart rate variability biofeedback perspective, like when we look at the research, is that there's actually not a ton of great research that says that like extending the exhalation is going to significantly raise heart rate variability. But what we do know is what happens physiologically, which is that we do see some increase in HRV when we extend the exhalation. And the reason being, just to kind of like paint the picture really, really quickly, is that when people are engaging in a breath cycle, when they inhale, a lot of people think, oh, that means like, the heart rate increases, so the gas pedal is being pressed on, the sympathetic nervous system is engaged. It's actually not the case. The case is that the brake pad that is being relinquished a little bit. So the vagal brake, or the parasympathetic nervous system, is taking the foot off the brake. The gas pedal is not necessarily being pushed down, but the brake is being pulled off, and then the heart rate increases. And then as we exhale, the brake is pressed downward. As we extend the exhale, we can continue to press that brake, which a lot of people subjectively experience as more relaxing than doing, let's say, like even breathing, or 5 in, 5 out. People like that 4-6, or as you mentioned earlier, a 5-7 breath. And then we do see some level of increase in HRV, but there's no studies that I've seen that to this date that have indicated that you can significantly increase HRV through an extended exhalation. A lot of the research is actually just like it's preference. For some people, they can significantly raise HRV with even breathing compared to exhalation. And then for some people, it's the flip flop or the inverse of that. For me, I'm such an extended exhalation guy. Like I like, again, 5 breaths per minute is my RF for my resonant frequency. So it's a 5-second inhale and a 7-second exhale. And for me, it is just so comforting to kind of like extend that exhale. I can just feel it. I feel my heart rate drop lower, and I see it too. But again, I think it's all going to depend on the person. So didn't know if you have anything else to mention there, or what you've seen, Patrick, but I just thought I'd clarify that in, because a lot of people get confused and say like, oh, you have to extend the exhale. It's not necessarily the case, but I find for a bulk majority of people, they like that subjective feel, and they will see a slight increase in HRV when they extend the exhale.
The bowl score is going to influence the person's ability to have an extended exhale. When we look at people, and maybe I'm just taking it to the extreme here, people with labored breathing, people with very poor functioning of the autonomic nervous system, they've got a low bowl score, maybe 5 seconds. These individuals will find it quite difficult to have that slow and prolonged exhalation. So maybe doing a small breath hold could be something to help, just, to get the process going. The other aspect, Jay, is maybe for people just to locate their pulse rate. So locate the carotid artery just at the angle of the jaw, and experiment with your breathing a little bit. So see what happens when you change your breathing patterns. If you breathe faster, what happens to your pulse rate? And if you start to breathe slower, what happens to your pulse rate? And if you take a fast breath in and a really, really slow and prolonged breath out, what happens to your pulse rate during the inhalation versus the exhalation? And the human body is an amazing thing, because when you think, the heart is efficient as well. The heart doesn't want to be pumping unnecessarily.
Right.
So the heart is pumping quicker when the lungs are richest with oxygen. So as we're drawing air into the body, the heart rate increases, because that, of course, the heart rate wants to be pumping this oxygenated blood. And then during the exhalation, it's almost that the heart is taking a little bit of a rest. So it's conserving energy.
Yes.
And so it's always coming back to, it's a miraculous what we have. All of that real estate just underneath the neck, that most of us don't pay any attention to.
Indeed.
That there's something amazing going on there.
There's a lot going on there.
This is the self-awareness that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, no, indeed. It's really funny, kind of the amount of what is going on through this area. If anybody's watching this, on our YouTube channel when we release that, which is kind of our hint. Hopefully, it'll be out by the time this podcast is here. But we're kind of showing the portion from the chin down to let's say the chest, or even the sternum area. But I would say more the neckline. What's crazy is being able to find the carotid artery for most people is pretty easily, but also too kind of on the lateral sides of the neck. I mean, that's where your innervations and the extensions of your vagus nerve is. I mean, it runs on both sides of the neck. And so there's a lot going on there that we can utilize as our ability, to detect it may be a little bit lower initially because we've come disconnected to that. You place it and feel, but kind of like we mentioned earlier, kind of pulling things full circle, is that the more and more you kind of check in with those things, you're going to develop a better sense of interoception, and you're just kind of feel it. And that might sound really weird to people, especially like just like feeling your heart rate. They're like, well, I thought if you felt your heart rate, that's kind of like a pounding heart or palpitations. At times it may feel like that, but then when you feel like the pace, like when you can sense the pace is not like a pounding, like, arrhythmic or even, just kind of a racing heart, then what you'll find is that you can tune in really quickly to your body and give a great assessment of kind of what's going on right in that moment. So yeah, a lot going on in between there that people need to not take for granted. That's good real estate for sure. So yeah. Awesome. Melissa, thanks so much for that question. That was really great. Here's what we're going to do. We're like an hour and 21 minutes into this, and I know we need to wrap things up. So you guys all probably are like, we came to the Q&A and we got one question. Hopefully all the other information that we provided was quite valuable. So yeah, we're going to leave you at one Q&A question today. We've got much more in the docket, and one of the things that I can do too, and that what we have been doing, so if anybody hasn't been listening, I will tune you into this, is that we're recording like HRV specific Q&A episodes. And so some of the questions too, that if we find them to be a little bit more HRV oriented, we can always push them to those. But otherwise, like, we'll keep going with the Q&A. Again, we hope that this was really valuable for people. And whatever. We did one question, like, I'm cool with it. Patrick, are you cool with it?
I think it's good. I think we had a great chat.
I agree. I totally agree. So what we're going to do, we're going to wrap it up today. Hopefully, again, you guys have learned some valuable information that you can take it now, put the boots on the ground and get going and practicing. Again, like, if we leave you with anything today, it's like, the best practice is the practice you do. So just find a way to incorporate it throughout the day. One of the things, I think I've mentioned this before, maybe I mentioned on a different podcast. I don't know. When you do so many podcasts, like, you kind of forget what you've said and what you haven't said, is that, like, I have actually become so conditioned to breathe in my car, like to do breath work in my car. Like, every single time I sit into my car, I start it and put on the driver's seat, like, my body just gets into the gear. Like, I'm breathing 5-7, like, I'm breathing really light. I'm fully kind of immersed in kind of that situation. I'm also paying attention to the road, just in case anybody's wondering. Hopefully not, mowing over people. That would not be a good idea. But for me, it's just this natural inclination to get to it. So find those places that just make sense, where you're like, I need to kill two birds with one stone. Like, I'm driving, like, it's a super, like, boring, like, almost like you could convince yourself, like, waste of time, because sometimes it is, especially if you're just sitting in traffic on your commute home. Like, use that as the opportunity to really engage in, like, good nervous system stress resiliency through breathing. So again, I think that's the huge take home today. So as we kind of wrap up, again, like, please make sure that if you haven't headed to this already, follow us on Instagram at Hanu Health, follow Patrick at Oxygen Advantage, at Buteco Clinic, and then my handle on Instagram is at Dr. J Wiles. Please remember too, like, if we read your review, which I'm about to do right now on the podcast, then we will send you out an amazing package. And our package is actually expanded. So Patrick was gracious enough to sign copies of his book, Atomic Focus, that, again, if we read your review on this podcast, we're going to send you that. We're also going to send you a huge supply of myotape, which is Patrick's mouth tape that I wear every single night. Do you still wear your own tape? I'm going to call you out on it. Do you wear yours every single night, Patrick?
Yeah, no, honestly, I do. Because part of the reason being is what I want to do is I need to experience what the user is experiencing.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And that's the best way to know it.
For sure. Yeah. And so for me, I wear it every single night. So we're going to send you that. We'll send you some Hanu Health gear, aluminum bottle, stress balls, die cut stickers. All you got to do, again, is write us a 5-star review on Apple. And then if we read your name here today, email us, podcast at Hanu Health. Say, hey, I was the person who you read on the podcast with Patrick. Here's my address. And then we'll send you that gear package. So today comes from Vic Amin, Vikamin. Vic Amin, and it said, glad I found you today. So I'm almost like, oh man, did they find us organically? Those are the best ones. It's like when, like, they don't necessarily follow us on Instagram or something. They just are like, man, I came across your podcast. So I was like, oh, I like this one. So Vic Amin said, low-hanging fruits are the best. This is the one case where advice and the action sound too good to be true, but follow the breath work road and you are on the path to better health. I think that's a really good one. I love it. I really do hope they found us organically. So yeah, good stuff. Awesome. Well, again, email us, podcast at hanuhealth.com. If you're not a part of the wait list, hanuhealth.com/waitlist. I mean, we got so many good things coming. Patrick, we'll call it a day today. Hey, great chatting with you. Awesome information through and through. Man, glad to have you on again, my friend.
Pleasure, Jay.
Awesome. All right, guys, we'll be back again next month with another Q&A. But as you probably already know, every single Friday we release a podcast where I interview leading guests in the field of breath work, stress resiliency, health and wellness. So stay tuned to next week. But Patrick, I will see you next month, my friend.
Great. Looking forward to it.
All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the Hanu Health Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. This podcast would not happen without listeners and supporters like you. And the best way to support us and the show is to head on over to iTunes and provide us with a 5-star review. This helps us reach others and spread the good word of breathing and stress resiliency. If we read your 5-star review on air, please reach out to podcast@hanuhealth.com with your name and mailing address, and we will send you some sweet Hanu gear. Until next time, breathe better and stress less.